Hello and welcome to another lecture for Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing Lauren Ralph's book, Living Through Injury in Gangland, Chicago. And this book, as you've read it, so you know that there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm not going to focus on everything. Rather, I'm gonna talk about some of the main points that in the book, according to my opinion. Right? You might have a different opinion of what's central to the book, and that's fine as well. So first of all, it's important to mention that Laurence Ralph conducted fieldwork in Eastwood, Chicago, and his research was centered on the causes and effects of gang violence, right? And so far we've seen a lot of different places where anthropologists do fieldwork. We've also talked a lot about different topics, different ways to approach different topics, right? Some of them have taken place really far away. Some of them have taken place closer to us, right? Quote unquote us, because we are all different. But when we think about Laurence Ralph fieldwork in Chicago, this is where he went to grad school, right? So he was basically doing fieldwork in the same place where he was living. And this allows for a different perspective. He worked closely with the gang that he refers to as the Divine Knights. And his research really sought to challenge these preconceived ideas of the relationship between gang violence, race, and poverty. So first of all, I want to think about some of the major concepts, right, or major ideas that Ralph is analyzing in his work. One of them is this idea of injury, right, and the way in which we can see injury in different ways in the landscape, right? We can see injury when we see wheelchairs, but we can also see injury when we see abandoned buildings, right? Both of these signs, right? Both of these objects represent a form of injury, a form of people not being able to reach their potential. Their potential, not in the sort of biological way, right? But rather in a social way, right? Because the injuries that Laurence Ralph is talking about here are produced because of history, because of society, because of different constraints that are being imposed on the people who live in Eastwood. So when we think about injury in this framework, that's not, it's a little bit broader, right? It encompasses more things than just physical injury. We can think about wheelchairs, of course, but also dilapidated houses, addictions, HIV, unemployment, gentrification, and this is seen as a weight that it's sort of influencing the future, but also as the effects of development that we tend to associate with something positive. But it has this other side that requires some form of structural violence in order for development to happen. And he also talks about dreams, right? But he compares this idea of dreams, of these, let's call them big dreams, right? That people are like Martin Luther King Jr. and Barack Obama, leaders of the African American community in the US had. He wants to compare these big dreams to these more ordinary dreams that people in Eastwood have, right? Not necessarily the dreams of social reform, but ordinary dreams, like going to school, getting a job. And he wants to claim, right, that the power of dreams is not necessarily accomplishing those dreams, but rather just having them. And he thinks that the relationship between injury, dreams, and poverty is really a complex relationship, where when people start seeing injury everywhere, their worldview starts sort of changing, right? And their dreams are adapted to this particular landscape. And he wants to take issue with this idea of poverty. And how do we explain poverty, right? There's this concept called culture of poverty, where in reality, scholars who have espoused this concept, and this has been criticized in a number of ways, and I think it has been criticized correctly, right? This idea of culture of poverty is the idea that poverty is mostly a result of individual choices, right? This idea that you're poor because you want to, because you're not saving those 5 cents, right, that are left behind your wallet once you've like paid all of your expenses, right? And people who think that this is the case want to say that poor people have adapted to poverty, and in a way they want to use it or enjoy it, and thus they cannot escape it. They need external help to break the cycle, and thus, like I was saying, this idea of poverty as culture is really naturalizes the idea of poverty, right? It's seen as a disease. And this has been criticized in several ways, right? First of all, you have to look at poverty, Ralph says, and I agree with this, is that you have to look at poverty from a structural perspective, right? Poverty is not the result of individual decisions. Poverty is the result of social structures that are conducing people, that are sort of channeling people into certain directions. That doesn't mean that people cannot escape poverty, right? That doesn't mean that individuals, particular individuals, cannot escape poverty or can become millionaires and famous and all of that, even when they were born in very difficult conditions. But that individual does not represent what the majority of people can do, right? So in a lot of ways, that those individuals are sometimes used to justify how social structures are used to keep certain populations in a particular class position, right? So that they can be mobilized in different ways. And this applies in particular to the so-called minorities, right? But it also applies to white people in different locations. So when we think about development, this idea that when people are poor, they need an external element to break that cycle, right? And this is problematic, right? Because it often comes from people who are not part of that community, who do not know what is happening in that particular community, and who have their own ideas of what success means. They have their own ideas of what a let's say beautiful neighborhood looks like, and oftentimes they don't really take into account what the people in that neighborhood want. So thinking about this, the first chapter, right? Laurence talks about the Divine Knights, a gang that lost its way, right? He talks about different symbols, right? The symbol of the cane that represents strength, right? Support, and all of these different symbols that you can see sort of represented throughout the neighborhood. I just thought maybe some of you would be interested in these different symbols that are used by the Divine Knights, the Vice Lords. And he wants to talk with, so going back to this idea of development, right? Eastwood needs to be understood as a place, not only as a geographical location, not only as a space, but as a place that is being inhabited and that acquires symbols, and it becomes symbolic to the people who live there, right? And Ralph wants to compare these two approaches, those of Tamara and Patrice, these pragmatic and idealistic approaches, right? And he wants to ask these two questions. How does Tamara see gangbangers, and what is Patrice's solution to the gang problem? So when you think about these two issues, right, I want you to remember that one of them is this idea, right, that you have to learn to live with the gang, that you have to learn to sort of give them what they want so that you can be safe. And the other approach really wants to reform, right, what ideas we have of the gang, criticizing the way in which maybe this gang violence has been normalized. But like I said, you can read more about this in the book. I also want to talk about shoes, right? And the way in which shoes, particular shoes, specifically Jordans, who I'm sure are gonna um, become even more important after the Netflix documentary, right? But he wants to analyze what this object, again, thinking about objects, what this object represents. And he wants to say that in Eastwood, gym shoes are emblems that embody historical consciousness, that embody not only your dreams, your aspirations, but also your place in the world in that particular moment, and your connections to other figures that are symbolic of not only Eastwood but Chicago, right? And he wants to say that shoes are very important because when you are taken to prison or to juvenile detention, in a lot of cases you change your clothes, right? So your clothes are all the same. People who are in juvenile detention are all dressed in the same way, but they get to keep their shoes, and their shoes tell each other, right? They tell a story, and people are able to understand who this person is based on their shoes. And there are different kind of shoes, right? That Ralph talks about, the teams, the Timberlands, right? And then there's the Air Force, and then there are more designer shoes. I think this one here is a LeBron James model, a Nike model, and then the Jordans, right? And he wants to say that all of these shoes have different value, and they all represent different things to different people, right? And people can gravitate to different shoes. But the shoes that are most desired are the Jordans. Why is it that the Jordans are the most desired shoes? First of all, they're expensive, right? So it's a status marker. It shows that you are making that money. But also because they connect you to Michael Jordan, right? And Michael Jordan, his importance is not only because he's, considered one of the best basketball player in history, right? Or at least one of the best, but also because he played for Chicago. So in a way, it's connected to Eastwood in that sort of geographical place. And in contrast to active players, right? So if you get other shoes, you never know if they're gonna lose value or not, because players who are basketball players who are playing right now, right? They might end badly, or their career might not be as significant in a way as the basketball career that Jordan had. So they might lose value, but Jordan is already sort of established in time, right, as one of the greatest players, and his value is probably not going to go down. There are other symbols that are connected, right? So Obama also connected to Chicago, and this Air Force One, I think they're mentioned in the book, right? They're also important in the community, but at the same time, something that happens is that they're showing, first of all, a political affiliation. They're talking about a politician who's, like, even if you think he's pretty good, politicians are already sort of in a muddy and complicated place anyway, so probably doesn't have the same appeal, the same value as the Jordans. So sure, shoes are valued under exclusivity and under pattern complexity, right? And even in contexts like West Side Juvenile Detention Center, where people wear uniforms, shoes are not replaced, like I was saying before. And this is another example, right, of how ordinary shoes, to buy those Jordans, become dreams for the people of Eastwood. So shoes, in a way, are a historical symbol and also provoke feelings of nostalgia, right? This idea, and nostalgia meaning this historical emotion, right? Longing for a home that no longer exists or has never existed. And they talk about different interpretations of Eastwood, and different sort of interpretations of the role that the Divine Knights have had in Eastwood. And we have Mr. Otis and we have Red, right? So Mr. Otis arrived from the south. He became part of the gang to protect himself from white neighbors who resented new black tenants. And the Divine Knights at this point in history had a complicated relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., right? And after his assassination, there were riots in the neighborhood. Businesses and jobs moved to other places using violence as an excuse. Something that we see still. During that time, Mr. Otis recalls that the Divine Knights were involved in more civic enterprises, right, such as housing opportunities. So they had a more sort of activist approach, according to Mr. Otis. And Mr. Otis laments the violence of the renegades who don't understand royalty, right? So the renegades here, in the title, right, meaning that they don't necessarily follow the rules established by the gang. And on the other hand, we have Red, and although Mr. Otis and Red are from different generations, right? So Mr. Otis criticizes Red. Red also feels nostalgic about the more recent past for different reasons. So when he sort of misses the time where the Divine Knights were proud and wore the colors, right? And when the Divine Knights, people who were part of the Divine Knights, really had to earn their shoes, right, and other material positions, right, as opposed to just getting them because they earned some money, they had to really earn it and be allowed to wear them to show that status, right? And this was a time when the war on drugs really turned the neighborhood into a prison pipeline. So Red feels nostalgic about the past because renegades don't have pride anymore. According to his perspective, they aren't loyal and they don't value the gang's structure. And this is where, again, renegades or independents come in, right? They are not necessarily part of the gang, but rather they work depending on their own interest, right? So they're often seen as selfish and directionless. They're seen as a threat to the gang, right? Because they don't want power, they just want money. They don't want to climb the ladder. They just want to earn that money. And if somebody else is offering their money, then they're gonna jump ship, right? They're not gonna stay with the gang. So they also are seen as a risk because they lack self-control and they can draw the attention of the police. But in a way, it's complicated, right? Because they are acting sort of as freelancers. But freelancers, as we see with other occupations, right, are sometimes stuck between two forces that are bigger than them. So for the renegades or independents, right, they're stuck between the police and the gang leaders, right? Because the police wants to take them to jail, of course, because of a lot of things that happen if the police get this quota, right? And the gang leaders are also worried about them, so they are sort of not necessarily respectful of the work that they do, or they don't value it as much because they don't see them necessarily as part of the gang, right? As part of the family. And Ralph wants to say that it's like people who drive Ubers and Lyft and work for Uber Eats and Postmates, right? And have to do all of this work, this really hard work, without necessarily getting having established hours, right? Or a lot of the benefits of other occupations, right? The renegades are also product of this flexibilization of labor, where sometimes you need people to do things, but you don't necessarily want to hire them, right? Rather, you allow them to be sort of freelancers and to do this work, but they won't necessarily get the benefits of that employment. Thank you.